Now that we have a working user model, it's time to add a capability few websites can live without, letting users sign up. We use an HTML form to submit user sign-up information to our application, which is then used to create a new user and save its attributes to the database. At the end of the sign-up process, it's important to render a profile page with the newly created user's information. So we begin by making a page for showing users, which will serve as the first step toward implementing the REST architecture for users. Along the way, we build on our work in Lesson 5 to write succinct and expressive integration tests.
In this lesson, we'll add a sign-up page to let users register for our site. This will be the first time we've written code that takes in information from the web and actually does something useful with it. In particular, it will involve making an HTML form to let users submit their information, which will then be saved to the database using the user model developed in Lesson 6. In the process of creating the sign-up page, we'll build on our work in Lesson 5 to write automated integration tests so that we don't have to keep testing the forms by hand. One of the things that will happen after people register for the site is that we'll want to have some sort of way to render their information. So our first step is actually to make a minimalist page to show users. And let me show you a mock-up of where we're going to be going in this lesson. So you can see this is really simple, just a profile photo and then the name of the user. So this is where we're going in this lesson, and then the eventual profile page will look something like this, where we have some sort of user icon, an avatar image, the name, and then some information about their followers and a list of their microposts. So this is kind of a minimalist Twitter style app, and it will take the rest of the tutorial to get to this point. But having this kind of page here is a good start and will be good enough to have as the final step in the registration process. So let's get started by creating a new branch. We're already on the master branch, as you can see here. Sign up. Now, one of the things that I like to do at this stage in development is to put some debug information on each page. So this is a really useful way of getting some insight into what's going on in our application. So let's take a look at this. This is going to go on the site layout. It's going to be app, controllers, and then, oh no, it's not, it's in views. It's layout, here we go. So what I'd like to do here is right in this part, right under the footer, I'm going to use something that comes built into Rails. It's called, percent equals. It's called debug. It's actually a method. And then I'm going to give it a variable called params. We'll be using params a lot in this tutorial. So params has useful parameters related to what's going on the page. So let's do this here. I'll show you what this looks like. Let's fire up the server. Go here. There we go. And so you can see here that that debug information is actually showing up at the bottom of the screen. Now, it looks terrible right now, so we're going to fix that up in just a sec, but there's just one extra thing I want to do. You notice that this says debug params, but if you think about this information, I mean, it potentially could be, quite sensitive. It might have passwords or so on. Certainly, we would not ever want to display this on a real site. So one of the things we want to do right from the start is only display this in development. So this is a development environment, and I can say interpolate into the template debug params if the Rails environment is development. So the way to do that is with rails.env. and then I can call a Boolean on this, development question mark. So this is true if and only if we're in a development environment. So I can save that. It won't change the behavior because we are in fact in development right now. But as we'll see at the end of this lesson, when we deploy this to production, this information will not appear. All right, so now that you can see that it's appearing, let's actually make it so that it looks okay. We'll do that by adding some CSS. All right, so what I want to do is actually add in what's called a mix-in. You can see here I've anticipated this. We have mix-ins, variables, etc. So I'm going to add some CSS that we're going to reuse in several contexts. So this is not actually CSS. This is SCSS. This is specific to Sass. So I'm going to call a mix-in. So mix-in, I'm going to call it box sizing. So this is a way to reuse CSS. And what I'm going to do is put in some rules for 3 different kinds of browsers. This is for Mozilla browsers, like Firefox. So actually the only important thing is this thing called border box. We're just going to put in 3 rules. WebKit's another HTML renderer used by a lot of different browsers. Actually want the same thing here. And then, oops, box sizing. All right, I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to add a new miscellaneous section here at the bottom. And if we look at this thing here, let's take a look at this. We can see that it's a pre-tag, which is pre-formatted text. It's just like literally appearing on the page. And you can see the class is debug dump. So what we're going to do is style that class with CSS. And now we're going to include that CSS from the top, this mix-in, with include. Again, this stuff here is just CSS, but this part here is Sass, this add include box sizing. And what it does is it just inserts this CSS here. So we'll be reusing this later in the tutorial. So let's take a look at that. Oops. So this is great. It actually caught a syntax error. We're missing a semicolon here. All right, now we can take a look at the debug information. It looks a lot better. So we can just take a look at what this gives us, even on this page. You can see that the debug information tells us which controller we're on, in this case static pages, and the action home. Now, of course, in many cases, the controller and action will be exposed in the URL, but in this case, we've mapped the root URL, which is a slash, so think of it as this here, to the static pages controller and the home action that's in the routes. So this here, this mapping, establishes that the root URL will be static pages controller, home action, and because of that mapping, it's not exposed in the URL, so this debug information is really useful in many contexts because we can figure out what those things are based on what appears down here, even if it's not in the URL. All right, what we want to do now is make a really minimalist user profile page. But of course, in order to have a profile page for a user, you actually need to have a user in the database. And that introduces a kind of chicken and egg problem, because how do you have a user if you don't already have a registration form? The answer is that we can bootstrap the process by creating a user at the console, which we did at the end of the last lesson. There's the first user in the database. If you do not currently have a user, you should create one now because we're going to need one for what we're about to do. All right, so let's take a look at the page that we actually want to use for the user profile. It's going to be at /users/1. You can see that there's nothing there right now. It just gives us an error. See here. No route matches get/user/1. So this is part of the REST architecture. Remember from lesson 2, it's representational state transfer. It's a set of standard URLs with standard behavior. In this case, we want /the resource name, which is users, /the ID to be a page for that user. In other words, the profile page. So we can get that to work by introducing, I guess I just closed the routes, we need it again. We can introduce a resource in the routes, resources, and then we give it a symbol, and it's a plural by convention, resources users. So now you can see that it's still an error, but it's a different problem. In this case, the problem is that there's no show action. So we can go to our users controller and put in a show action. So it'll give us a different error. Now we're missing the show template, so let's do that. It's going to be in views, users. And now I just want to, let's just start off with the user's name and email. We won't actually expose the email on the real site, but this is just to give us a sense of actually having the information in the database being displayed on the application. So let's start with this. So what we're going to do is define an instance variable @user. Remember that this instance variable, when defined in a controller, is automatically available in the views. So we're going to say user.name. Let's just put in the user's name and email address here. So just to get started. So we can take a look at this. This won't work. Of course, because we don't actually have a name for this @user, because there is no @user. Now, this is a very common kind of error message. You can see here it says undefined method name for nil class. And you might think, well, what's going on there? And the answer is that regular variables, if you try to access, say, an attribute, will just give you an error. So, in fact, let me start up the console again. Suppose I did this. So user.name, this will give me one kind of error. This will complain that there is no user. But the way that instance variables work is that, in fact, they do exist. So @user, in a sense, I mean, they don't exist in the sense that they're nothing, they're nil, but they're not undefined. So instance variables, if you try to access them when they're not defined, will return nil rather than giving you an error. So if I just do this, it'll say that there's no such variable. Undefined local variable, but @user will just return nil. So if you get an error in your browser or in a test that complains about something not existing on a nil class, that means that you didn't define the variable. Or in particular, it means you didn't define the necessary instance variable. So we can define that in here. You can say @user equals, and see if you can figure this out. Remember what we did in the last lesson. How do we find users in the database? We did something like this. User.first returns the first user. In fact, that will actually work here. Take a look at it. There it is. Name and email address. That's right. But of course, this only works for this one user. So we can generalize this, but by recalling the find method. User.find of 1, which is the ID. There we go. So let's look at our browser. Remember, we've got this debug information. So in the debug information, you can see that we've got the controller, which is the users, action show, and we've got this ID, which is 1. So remember that we put in this this template. Here it is. This is debug of params. So what this thing is here, this is a representation using a format called YAML of the params hash. So params is effectively a series of key value pairs, controller users, action show, ID 1. So what we can do is we can pull out that ID in the users controller, like this. Params, and then a symbol corresponding to the attribute, in this case ID. So params of ID here is just this one. So if we refresh this, it should be the same, and there it is. By the way, you might notice that here I used an integer, but params of ID is actually the string, but the find method is actually smart enough to convert this thing to an integer before trying to find it in the database. So this is a great start, even though it's really minimal. We are actually now dynamically pulling out the information from the database using user.find and displaying the information to a web page. And you can see, because we're actually using this ID, that this is going to work for lots of other different IDs. And so by writing one piece of code here, this profile page, we'll effectively have a profile page for every single user in the database, which could be thousands or even millions. Now there's something really useful here that I'd like to show you. This is fairly new in Rails, but you can now put a debugger right in the Rails code. If you run into trouble, which happens pretty often, you can do this. Just put in the line debugger. I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to refresh the page. And it just kind of hangs, and that's because there's now a debugger inside of this terminal tab that's running the server. So you can see this is called bybug, and it shows us where it stopped. So it stopped here, and this is the next line of execution. So what's really cool here is we can actually inspect this thing. We can do @user.name, @user.email, and so on. So this is kind of a console, effectively, right inside of our application. So this is, like I said, relatively new, but this is unbelievably powerful. Like, this happens all the time where something will not be working, and you'll want to sort of drill down into your application and figure out what's going on. So I would say if that happens, but more realistically, when that happens, this is a great technique, just to stick a debugger line in and then inspect what's going on, look at what the values are. So for example, if we did something like this, well, suppose we actually just commented out the whole line. By the way, to release this, we can do Control D. That continues the execution, so let's refresh it again to get that debugger again. So now I might be getting an error. Well, more realistically, let's just look at this here. So let's get rid of this line. So suppose I had this, oops, I need to do Control D again. Control D. Right, so suppose we had this problem with what is going on? I don't understand what's going on. Well, it tells me that it's this line here, and that's being called from the controller. It's being rendered from the show action. So let's fire up a debugger in here and refresh it. Get our terminal here. And let's say @user. See, oh, it's nil. I see the problem. And in fact, in some contexts, which is kind of cool, you might have noticed that when we got this error, there's actually a console here. Looks like it's kind of stuck, though. Actually, I'm kind of curious myself to see what happens here. Release this. Yeah. So this is actually another situation. Sometimes you'll get this kind of error, and you'll have a little debugging console right here. But if that isn't the case, if it's some other problem, so for example, if we had this, remember we did this here, just as a demonstration. Suppose we had this, but then we were checking on /user/5, and we're like, why isn't it showing the information for user 5? Then in that case, we could put in a debugger. So this works even if we don't have that little console in the browser. So I was like, I don't understand. Why isn't it working? Oh, I see it. @user's ID is 1. Ah, it's because I was stupid and put first here instead of actually using find. So there we go. Great. All right, now that we've got a basic profile page working and we've taken a moment to look at this powerful debugging technique, we're ready to start adding something that looks more like this mockup I showed you, where we've got an image representing the user and then the name of the user. So let's go to the show page. What we're going to do here is let's provide a title. Remember, the provide method defines the title that's automatically displayed on the page. So let's look at, say, what was it? Maybe the about page. So provide title and then a string, which is the name of the page. But in this case, we'd actually just like to use the name of the user. That's a nice thing to use in the title. So let's do this here. Just do @user.name. And then let's put in a header 1 tag, an h1 tag. And we want to get this image here. So let's make a helper for that. Actually, I want to defer that just a moment, but I do want to put the user's name in here. So let's just start with this. The syntax highlighting is telling me there's something wrong. What is wrong here? Actually, you can't tell what's wrong offhand. Huh, looks like it's working. That's weird. Huh, the highlighting was leading us astray. Interesting. All right, so this is a better start. Now we've got an h1, and we can also see here in the tab, it's got the name of the user, which is in this case my name. And then remember, we also have the base title, Ruby on Rails tutorial sample app. Now, if you've got much experience with web development, or even if you know the kinds of things that can go wrong, at this point you might be concerned that we're just sticking this user's name into the title and into the regular template, just into this h1. But the user's name is something that they submit, right? That's something that we're going to actually let users create through the web. And this is a potentially serious security hole. You can do something like put some JavaScript in the name field, say, and use it to launch an attack. That would be a cross-site scripting attack. So what ends up happening in Rails is that any information that's inserted into the template is escaped out. So for example, if I were to, say, put in a JavaScript, this is simulating what would happen if someone put in a script, and then some JavaScript and so on. So suppose that instead of the name Michael Hartle, I'd use Michael Hartle plus a script and then some dangerous stuff in here. So we can take a look at what this does. So this actually just inserts it literally. So if we inspect this, that's kind of weird actually. That's not what I expected it to look like at all. I expected it to look escaped out. Yeah, here we go. That's kind of weird actually. The inspector, that's really a strange behavior. So the inspector is actually showing it as script, dangerous stuff, and then closing script. But if I actually show the source, you can see what it is. It's this. It's &LT semicolon. This is the HTML code for this less than sign. So what it's doing here in Rails is it's escaping out this dangerous content by converting this thing to its HTML character code. What that means is that if someone tries to insert something dangerous, or even just something simple like putting something in bold, which would be kind of weird, that's weird stuff. In this case, it's also just going to be escaped out. So you can see here, instead of actually putting it in boldface, it's escaped it out. So in contrast, you could do this to show you. This is what it looks like when it's not escaped out. Right. So you can see it's, instead of an actual bolded couple of words, we have this escaped out version. All right, so we've got the name part from this mock-up here, this. So let's get that gravatar, this avatar image as well. So the word avatar has been used for quite a while now in computing, especially in the context of web applications, to refer to this sort of image that represents the user. It doesn't have to be a photograph, it can be an icon or something like that. And there's a service called Gravatar, which stands for Globally Recognized Avatar. It's really useful for this purpose. Among other things, it lets us defer the difficulty of uploading and formatting images. And we can pass that off to the Gravatar service. So what we're going to do here is we're going to define a helper called Gravatar for, and then the name of the user. And of course, this doesn't exist yet, so it's going to cause an error if we refresh it. Right. So the place to put this Gravatar helper, it depends on how we're going to use it. In this case, Gravatars will be used principally with respect to users. So what we're going to do is put it in the helper file for users. That's the logical place to put it. So it's just a regular Ruby method. And so our method will return the Gravatar for the given user. So the Gravatar will just be an image. And let's define it. This is our first example of a helper that we defined ourselves. Actually, that's not true. It's the second one. Remember, we did this before. We did application helper. So we've got a full title helper. This is now the Gravatar for helper, and it's going to take in a user. And let's take a look at this. So the way that Gravatars work is that there is a URL that then has an ID associated with the Gravatar. So this will seem a little bit like magic initially, but this is just the kind of thing that you can learn by reading the Gravatar documentation. So the way that it works is that Gravatar uses what's called an MD5 hash. It's a particular cryptographic hash of the email address. So let's take a look at that. So it turns out that the MD5 hashing algorithm is actually loaded by Rails, so it's available on the console, and you can access it like this. MD5 hex digest. This is the kind of thing, again, you could just Google around or read the APIs. This is the sort of thing that I don't even remember how I learned about this thing, but it certainly is not something I would have guessed. So we can do this. So this hash is part of the URL that Gravatar uses. So let me show you the form of that. The Gravatar URL looks like this. It's HTTPS. So this S is for secure. It's a secure URL. Just to emphasize it, I guess, they call it secure.gravatar.com/avatar/ and then the ID. So it would be something like this. Just put this in here. Oops, I need to copy this. And then what we want to do is render back an image tag of that Gravatar URL. And then let's give it an alt. Remember we did this on the, what was it? It was the home page. We have this image tag helper. So it takes in the name of the image and then some alternative and then the URL. So in this case, the alt, let's just use the user's name. And we actually don't need the, oh, I'm sorry, this is for the link to. Never mind. The image tag just has the name and then some key value pairs here. So this is alt user.name, and then let's give it a class so we can style it. Oops, and this should be in quotes. Let's give it a Gravatar class, a CSS class. By the way, you might notice the syntax highlighting. This is because in Ruby, the word class is a keyword, but in this case, this does not refer to a Ruby class. This refers to a CSS class, but the editor doesn't know that. So let's save that and take a look at what we've got. Cool. So this is the Gravatar image here. This is the default Gravatar image. And the reason it's the default is because there is no Gravatar associated with this email address. In fact, it's impossible, at least for normal people, to get an email address at example.com. It's kind of cool, actually. Example.com, in fact, is reserved for exactly this kind of example. So example.com is the right thing to use. It's actually part of the standard for the web, but that means you can't have an email address there. So let's do this. Let's just build this up here. So this is the Gravatar ID. So this is, again, just hard-coded. Oops, it should be this here. Let's interpolate it. So we're just building this up piece by piece, so this should still work. Right. So now what we actually want to do, though, is calculate the hex digest of the user's email address. So let's do that right in here. And let's change the user's email address to something that actually makes sense. It's a real email address. And I'm going to change the name at the same time, so let's just do this. Actually, do we have a user? I don't think we do. No. Okay. So let's update the attributes. So I'm going to use an address that I control, example at railstutorial.org, and I've associated this email address with a gravatar at the gravatar website. And remember, we need this to be valid. We could actually do this with update attribute twice, and we wouldn't have to put in the password. But in this case, we're using update attribute, so we need the password and the confirmation. This is because of the validation on the password supplied by has secure password. Right. This implicit in has secure password is some validations on the password and confirmation. We can bypass those by using update attribute, but in this case, update attributes, plural, requires them. So, all right, so now let's take a look at that. Look again at our helper. So what this is doing is it's just accessing user.email. It's calling this MD5 hex digest method, and then it's interpolating that ID into this URL, and it's putting the image on the page, and this should work. There we go. So this is the image that I've associated with that email address. Now there's one other thing I want to do. I want to show you. If I upcase this email address, it'll actually break. And the reason for that is that the MD5 hash is case sensitive. So this here is a different hash from this. By the way, you might notice I'm using the word hash here. It's tangentially related to the idea of the kind of key value hashes that we have in Ruby, because these are actually pretty good for uses as the keys sometimes. In some contexts, you'll have a hash table. But they're not the same thing. Unfortunately, this is standard terminology just to mix Ruby hashes with hash digest and so on. If you want, you can call it a digest to be clearer. But in any case, this thing is case sensitive. Now, in our case, we've got this user model where we're actually downcasing the email addresses we've standardized. And that was in order to have uniqueness of email addresses at the database level. But we shouldn't rely on that, because you never know, in what context we might use this gravatar for helper. So it's probably a good idea to standardize on downcase here too. This will never actually make a difference, but this just makes the helper a lot more robust. It means that it will never fail due to this case sensitivity issue. So now it's back again. And at this point, we're pretty close to that mockup. You can see here, we want things kind of moved to the left and maybe styled a little differently. So as a last step, we're going to add some extra HTML structure and some CSS. Let's do that. Go to this here, and where is it? It's in show. So I'm going to put in some extra tags here. It's a div tag, and then I'm going to have an aside tag. This is using a tag for this kind of sidebar. So what the user profile page will have this sidebar information. You can see here, it's going to be, it'll end up being this kind of thing, this sort of sidebar. So that's why we're using aside. And actually, let's give this a class. This is a bootstrap class. And I'm going to give it a section. The class user info. We'll style that ourselves. And then inside here, I'm going to put the h1. Let's do this. Save that and see what it did. Probably didn't do very much. No, it actually did more than I expected. But you can see the styling is all messed up, so let's put in some CSS to fix that. The exact form of the CSS isn't important for the purposes of this tutorial, so what I'm going to do is just paste it in from the book. let's go here. There we go. Let's just copy this here. Put it in here. Just take a look at the structure. You can see we've got some nesting here. This is SCSS and not just CSS. So we've got styling for the aside. Actually, let's just split this. We've got styling for the aside here. We've got styling for the section. There's some padding. This ampersand, remember, refers to the parent, which is just section in this case, the parent tag. The first child, this means that the first section will have some special styling. And then this span is actually an anticipation of some future things we'll be doing. And then we've got some gravatar classes here, and this is for the actual gravatar, and again, this is anticipating some future styling later in this tutorial. Let's save that and take a look at it. Alright, there's still something wrong. You can see that this footer here is kind of in the middle of the profile, and I think I know why. I think it's because this div needs another class on it, or it needs a class. So we're going to give another class in this section. It's going to be class equal to row. Let's take a look at that. There we go. So now this is a pretty good real-life version of this mock-up that we saw. So we've got the avatar and then the name. All right, now that we've got a good start on the profile page, it's time to actually make our sign-up form. So let's take a look at the mock-up of that. So remember, our users have a name and then an email, which we're also using as the login, the unique username, and then password and confirmation. So what we want to do is make something that looks roughly like this that will let users submit their information to our application. So let's take a look at how to do that. I actually want to start by getting rid of this user. It was useful to have that user as a bootstrap technique to let us start on the profile page before actually having a working sign-up form. But we're actually about to create a working sign-up form, so I want to get rid of it. And we saw in the last lesson that you can do that by removing the database. You can just remove this file. You can just remove db development.sqlite3. But there's a more Railsy way to do that, which is to use the actual reset method. So that's rake db migrate reset. Part of the reason that's better than just removing the file is that this command will work for databases other than SQLite. So let's take a look at the server. It's a good idea after doing something like that to restart the server. So I'm just going to do that. Let's recall where we are in terms of this sign-up page. We actually do have a route for this. Right, so this will be a sign-up page for new users. It will be. We're actually going to fulfill this promise in the next few sections. So let's take a look at how to do this. So let's go to App, Controllers, and this is the user's controller. So remember, this new page, this is /signup, but we can look at the routes. All right, /signup is actually being routed to users new. So that's in the user's view. So it's in, or the new view in the users directory here, app views users. So this is what produces this page here. And this is where we'll actually put this form. So we've already got our title and our h1. I'm going to put in a div. In fact, it's going to be very similar to what we just did with the profile. Remember here. And copy over some of this stuff. We're going to have a row, and it's actually just the row. So we're going to start with this. And then there's another div. Again, these are bootstrap classes related to columns on the grid. put our ending divs. There's our ending div and another ending div. All right. So this is where the real magic happens. So we're going to use a Rails method called form_for that's going to create a form for manipulating a user. And in this case, we actually want an @user variable. Remember, here we did @user equals user.find, and then we were able to use that user here @user.name, @user.name. So what we want to do here is create a new user. Rather than defining it in the database, it should be equals, and we're just going to use the constructor user.new. This is just a blank user variable. So @user equals user.new, and then let's put in the form_for. So form_for is a predefined method in Rails, and we're going to give it the @user, and it's going to use the information inside this user. Remember, users know their own attributes like the email address, the name, and so on. It's going to use that to construct a form for manipulating this user, in this case for creating the user. So form_for takes a block with a one variable. We'll call it f for form. You can see this is all inside embedded Ruby, so this is being evaluated as Ruby. And in fact, the equal sign indicates that we're actually putting something into the template. Older versions of form_for actually worked without that, but this is a better design. And we need an end. So remember, there's a do and then an end. This is how you deal with blocks. So this is embedded Ruby. I'm going to have now a block inside of embedded Ruby. And now what we need to do is create these kinds of fields: name, email, password confirmation. So Rails comes with helpers for that, and in this case, because we're giving a block variable here, they're actually attached to this object, this form object. So in particular, we can create a label. That's this thing here, this name here. That's the label. So let's give it. We can give it a symbol. Rails will actually know what to do with that, as we'll see in a moment. And in fact, we can actually just do this incrementally. We can even save this here and take a look at it. Here we go. As you can see, it's just a bare label. There's nothing else here yet. But you can see that there's something working. That's pretty impressive. All right, so let's add in a text field corresponding to this here, this thing here. So this is an HTML text field. So let's do f dot. We'll take a look at the HTML structure in a moment. Again, this takes a symbol. This is a Rails method. It takes a symbol, which is the name of the attribute. Let's take a look at what that does. So you can see the styling isn't quite right compared to the mock-up, but this is a good start. We can actually type into this already. We want name, email, password, and password confirmation right from our mock-up. Right, these are the name, email, password, password confirmation. So let's just copy this here. Do this here. It's too many new lines, so let's do this here. So this is email. Oh, by the way, you could see here that it's capital N name. So Rails knew what to do with this label. It automatically capitalized it. So this is email, and this is password. Actually, I didn't need to do that, did I? So there we go. Let's take a look at this. All right, the styling's all messed up, but we can already see that we're going to be able to put things in here. Now, there's one thing you might notice, though, if I start putting in a password. Oh, that's not good. Right, I can actually see it. That is not the usual convention. The usual convention is to have these be asterisks like this. So let's use the field for that. It's actually called password field. So here we are. Now if I type into this box, aha, that's exactly what I was hoping for. And now let's add the final thing, which is the submit button. And this takes in some text. I'll call it create my account. And let's give it some classes. These are Bootstrap classes. It's a button and it's a primary button. So button, button primary. Take a look at that again. All right, so now all we need is some CSS to style this thing. So let's open up our CSS file. This is going to be some CSS for forms generally. And I'm just going to copy this in from the tutorial book. So let's go here. Here it is. Copy this in, and the main thing I want you to notice here is that we've actually reused this box sizing. So this is what this mixin gets you. This box sizing mixin is we can reuse it in multiple places just using add include. Or we use it for the debug information here, the debug dump. But so now we're using it also for this form. So let's do this and refresh it. And there we go. That's a pretty good match for the mockup. The only real difference is the button here, which is now all the way across the screen. But that's the kind of thing that's okay not to match up between a mockup and the actual page. But this is good. This is a really good start. Oh, there's one more thing I want to do. You can see here it says password and password confirmation. Again, the mockup doesn't have to match exactly, but we have password here and confirmation here. And this is actually just a useful technique to know. This is fine having password confirmation here, but I actually want to show you how to change that if you don't want it to match up exactly. So this is on new. So you can, what Rails is doing, you can see what it's doing is it's taking this and it's basically capitalizing the first letter and getting rid of this underscore and turning it into a space. That's actually the label here. So that's where this comes from, password confirmation. It's being transformed from here. But sometimes maybe you might want it to be something different. So let's do this. Let's say confirmation. So there's actually an optional argument here, which is a string, which is the name of the field. So let's take a look at that. There we go. All right, there's a lot going on here, so I want to break this down into smaller pieces just to get a sense of how this is being created, how this form is being created. And in the process, we'll actually take a look at some of the HTML that's being generated by these helpers. So just the overall structure, I want to show you that we were talking about this. There's this block structure, form for the user, do F, and then inside of here, we've got this F object, and then we're building up the label and text field for each of the attributes. And so this form variable F is essentially an abstraction layer. I don't know how password field, for example, is implemented, but I do know that if I call that method on the form variable, that it will produce this sort of box. So let's take a look at the HTML that underlies this. Take a look at this form. So you can see here we've got label and then an input tag. So this label tag is what's being created by this here. And then the input tag is the HTML tag for this sort of input box, this guy here. And down here you can see it's also an input for password, but then there's a different type. So type equals password. And up here it's type equals text. So that's the difference between this here and this here. You can also see here that the input has a name, which is user of name. So this is in square brackets. This is just a string, but Rails is interpreting this, or Rails will interpret this. When we submit it, Rails will use this name to construct the params hash, essentially, which will let us actually create the user in the database. We'll see that momentarily when we actually submit this form. But for now, there's one more thing I want to show you, which is this weird kind of thing here, this input authenticity token. This is the kind of thing that whenever you see this sort of long string, you can safely ignore this. This is something that's being used internally by Rails. In this case, it's being used to prevent a particular kind of attack called a cross-site request forgery, or a CSRF attack. You can also see there's a line here that has this weird value. It's actually a check mark. And again, this is just used internally by Rails to force the browser to use the right character encoding scheme when we submit the information. So I mentioned it because it does show up here when we inspect it, but this is the sort of thing that you should probably learn to ignore at least at first and focus on these sorts of things here that actually correspond to the code that we've been writing. And you can see, by the way, here, this last one, also an input tag, and then it has the name commit. That's something that just comes automatically from the submit tag, this sort of submit helper. And then it's got the type, which is also implicit in the kind of helper, the helper that we read, the submit method. And then the value is what we put in, create my account. So by studying this HTML structure, you can see the effects of these kinds of Rails helpers. So if it ever gets a little bit too abstract, just open up this inspector and take a look at what's being produced by the Rails helpers. All right, so we've got a great start here. We've got a sign-up form that actually has correctly rendered HTML, but of course it doesn't actually do anything yet. So the first step is to actually handle an unsuccessful sign-up. So if someone rolls into the site and clicks create my account without putting anything in, or puts in a blank name but and maybe an invalid email address, we want to handle that. So let's take a look at a mock-up of what we hope for. This is the sign-up page we just made, and when a user submits invalid information, what we'd like is to return the same form and then just have some error messages. So for example, name can't be blank, email is invalid, password is too short, etc. So these are based on the validations that we defined in the last lesson. Remember, we saw that there's actually an errors object that has messages in it, and those messages are what will end up being displayed on the page. So let's get this form working. Let's recall how this works in general. I'm going to inspect this again. And here I want to focus on this part here, this form tag. And you can see that it's got an action users and method post. So according to the REST convention used by Rails, when you post to the users URL /users, that's the operation for creating a new user object that's thought of as part of the user's resource. So we can actually get a sense of what this is doing by submitting the thing. So what that did is that sent post to /users, and we get this unknown action error. The action create could not be found for users controller. So the create action is what gets called when you post to /users. So what we need to do in here is define a create action. And you might wonder, like, how did the routing happen? You know, how did Rails know if we posted to /users to try to route to the create action? And the answer is that's what this line does, among other things. So this sets up all of the standard URLs. We've talked about this before, but now we're actually using it in a real application. Of course, this page isn't very useful, so let's actually render something here. Just as a first step, I'm going to pull out the user from the params. This is not the final implementation, as we'll see. So if we can save the user successfully, remember this returns true if it's successful, then we're going to handle a successful save. So for now, I'll just put a comment in here indicating we're going to do that. Else, and this is what's going to happen on an invalid submission. So let's just render back this page. Remember, in our mockup here, we want it to render back the sign-up page, so that's new. And we can do that with the render method. Just render new, like this. This will render this method here, the render, or the new action. Or rather, I'm sorry, it actually, what it does is it renders the new template. This does not call this. What this does is it renders the new template. And you can see here that, remember, we've got this @user variable. We've defined it here as well. So let's see what that does. Resend it. All right, there's still an error, and you can see that it's forbidden attributes error. We'll discuss that in more depth in just a moment, but for now I want you to see in the parameters here what the request consisted of. So these are the things I told you not to worry about. It's just this check mark and the authenticity token, but this is the real core of it right here. So this is what's been submitted. There's a user. This comes from this form here. Because Rails knows it's a user. Rails knows the user's class name. This is not right here. This is not because we used a variable called user. It's because it's a user class. And the hash here, the attributes hash, consists of the things that we submitted in the form. In this case, it was just blank, email blank, name, and actually empty. And then you can also see that inside of these parameters, this is actually what appears in the Rails log, and it's dangerous in general to have passwords appear anywhere in sort of plain text. So these are filtered automatically by Rails. That restriction does not apply to debug, and we'll see in a moment that we actually will see those passwords, which is why it's so important not to show them in production. All right, so this right here is the params hash, and so you may have wondered, well, why is it if we did params of user that we weren't able to create a new user? Because that's how you initialize users, with a hash like this, right? And the answer is that it's really insecure to allow this sort of submission through the web, because if you had other attributes here, suppose that you used a command line client or used JavaScript to alter the form, so that, for example, you could put in another attribute, say an administrative flag that indicates whether a user is an admin or not, which we'll actually do later in this tutorial. If we allowed that sort of submission and we just built up this user using the params hash, then potentially anybody could, say, become an admin of a site, which is terrible. It's a terrible security hole. So this used to be allowed by default in Rails, and there was a way around it, but it's really good to be secure by default. As we saw, for example, with the show page, it's really good that it escapes this information, that Rails escapes out any special characters in here by default. And similarly, it's a really good idea for this to be an error by default, which it is. We saw this that's what the forbidden attributes refers to. So what we need to do is tell Rails explicitly that these attributes are okay, these ones here, the name, email, password, and confirmation. And the way we do that is with two special methods called require and permit. So what we're going to do is we're going to put in here user params. This is just a convention. We're going to create a method that returns the parameters that we want to allow. This is not used anywhere through the web, so we're going to make it private. And it's a really good idea, I think, to put a level of indentation here. I think the editor is actually going to complain about this, but I think it's a good practice. I'll tell you why in a moment. So params. So what we're going to do is we're going to tell Rails which parameters are required. In this case, this hash here, this params hash, must have a user key. Now, these are strings, but internally, once this gets through to the controller, they're actually symbols. So we're going to say params.require. So this form must submit a user, and that happens automatically by virtue of this. Because this is a user class, Rails knows to create a hash with symbol user. And then we want to permit the following attributes. So this is name, email, password, and the password confirmation. So let's do this. Save this. If I did this here, it's actually too long. It goes over this 80 column limit. So the reason I like to put in this extra level of indentation is because it's really easy to lose your place. And so I've had situations where, you know, I'll be way down in some file and I'll add a method to the file, and then I won't know, like, why is it not working? And so I used to see people put in this extra level of indentation. I thought, that's stupid. Why would you bother with that? But then I got bitten by that several times. So the reason, if you define a method here and then try to use it, say, in a different part of the application, it won't work because it's private to this class. So anyway, this is a good practice, I think. It's not all that important, but I think it's a nice little touch. And it looks like the editor didn't complain. I thought it complained about this, but anyway. So this is a private method only used inside of this class. And here it is. We're going to call user params here, and then create a new user based on this sort of filtered version of the hash. So we're requiring user, and we're permitting these attributes. So let's see how that works. Just go back and create it again. And so you see, actually, it didn't give me an error. That something actually happened there. You may not have, don't blink, you might miss it, but here I'm submitting it. And in fact, we can see here, this is the debug information, name, email, password, password confirmation. And in fact, we can now put in the name, put in a couple of things here, and maybe just leave those blank. We can put in something here. And so you can see here, I actually have the correct data. So as I mentioned, password and confirmation do appear, so that's dangerous. But that's why it's only in development. It's actually not that dangerous because typically users would only see their own password, but it's a bad idea ever to expose passwords. But in any case, you can see that we're now actually submitting information. This is going through the create action. So what's happening here is we're submitting it. Rails is routing it via the REST convention. So we're posting to /users. Rails knows to route that because of this here to the create action. Then we're creating a new user with user params set by this. And then what's happening here is that because the user is invalid, it's not saving it, and it's falling through to this step here, render new, and then it's rendering this page again. And one of the things you might notice is that it actually pre-fills the name and email. Rails knows not to pre-fill the password and confirmation because they're password fields right here. Because they're password fields, it blanks them out. But this is actually kind of tricky if you think about it. Like, how is this working? And the answer is that when we go just to this page, when you just go to sign up, this is being rendered. This code is being rendered based on this new user. But when we submit things, so just put in some stuff here. But when we submit this, what's happening is it's based on this user that actually does have attributes. And so you might think, well, how does Rails know to put these in? And that's because inside of new, this @user variable is now the one that's been defined here. And so it actually has the parameters from user.new user params. So what Rails is doing is pre-filling the name and email attributes, or these fields, with the attributes of the corresponding user. Right here, which comes from right here. Now, one thing you may have noticed is that while we do have this form being returned and re-rendered, there aren't any error messages. Remember, we wanted that in this mockup. We want to have some error messages here corresponding to the things that are wrong with the submission. So just to refresh our memory, let's take a look at a console here. And I want to put in a user. Let's see, user.new. So let's make some invalid entries here. So let's do, so the name there is valid, but the email is not. So the password and confirmation will match each other, but they're too short. So let's save that user. It should not let me do it. It says false. That means the save didn't happen. And recall that we have an errors object now after trying to save it. Actually, I think before we saw it, after we called user.valid ? But it happens when you do user.save as well. So user.errors, and you can see here that there are some messages. We're going to say full messages, .full messages. So these are the messages we'd like to put onto the web page. So you can see here in the mockup, things like this. This is where they're going to come from. Rails has synthesized these error messages for us, and we just want to put them on the web page now. So let's take a look at the new page. The way we're going to do this is we're going to make a partial for error messages. In fact, let's do this here. We're going to reuse this later on in the tutorial in lesson 11 for microposts. So this is going to be in a shared directory. In fact, this is not the kind of thing that will work out of the box with microposts, but this is a first implementation, then we'll refine it later in the tutorial. Remember, the way you render a partial is you put the name of the file minus the underscore. In this case, it'll be in the shared directory. So this is what it's going to look like. We're going to render some error messages, and that's going to give us this here, this area here. So we need to create this though, and this is going to be in the shared directory of the views, which does not currently exist, so let's make it. New folder, shared, and then new file. Remember the convention on partials, there's a leading underscore, so underscore error messages. .html, .erb. Not sure the B got, yeah, there it is. Okay, it worked. So now this error messages partial will render those error messages. Let's see how this works. We only want to render messages if there are any, and the way to do that is like this. So this is so user.errors.any. This return is true if it's not empty, so there it is. In this case, it's true because, in fact, there are some errors. So if there are any errors, we're going to actually put in the explanation of the errors. So let's just put the end here. And that'll go inside a div. And we want to give it an ID in this case. We're going to say that this can only appear once on a page. Doesn't really matter. This doesn't get enforced. It's just good practice in the sense that the page won't validate if you have the ID on more than one tag. You may recall there's a shortcut if we do dot and then the name of the class and hit tab. This is just the IDE. Then it will create the div with that class. You can do this too with the CSS ID notation. So let's call it error explanation. Hit tab. And then inside here I want div with two classes, actually. I'm actually not sure if this will work. Oops, I want this. I want alert. And then I want a second class, which is alert danger. And these are bootstrap classes. So I want to say the form contains some number of errors. So we can do that here. This is going to be wrong for a moment. I'll show you in a second how to do it right. So at user.errors.count is the number of errors. Contains this many errors. And then let's actually put the errors in as an unordered list. So that's a UL. And each list item will be one of the error messages. So remember that's this here. You can actually just copy this. So for each of these messages, remember we have an @user variable. It's up here too. You can see why this won't work for microposts. We're going to have to change this so that it doesn't actually tie itself to the user. It works for other objects too, but for now we can just use the information we know, which is that we have an @user variable. So @user.errors.fullmessages.each do message, and then put in an li for each of these. And actually, I think the convention I use is to put these at the same level of indentation, and then so the indentation here for the li is one extra level from the ul. But it's not that important. But here we go. Save that. By the way, that count here, this here is just, that's a very general method. This can be called on all kinds of things. We can see here user.errors.count. Just insert the number of errors. There is something wrong though, I mentioned briefly, so see if you can figure it out. So this should actually be working. Let's take a look at this. Look at that. The form contains 3 errors. Email is invalid, password can't be blank, password is too short. So this is a really good start. There are a couple of things I want to do. I want to change the styling a little bit, and I want this box to be surrounded by some sort of color to indicate like which fields have errors. There's something else that's bad that you can see here. If I do this, make this valid, and then just have one error. So you can see here the form contains 1 errors. This irritates me. I see this all over the web. I see it in apps. It's amazing how frequently one encounters this mistake. But it's really easy to avoid. And in the case of Rails, we can use a really cool method called pluralize. Let me show you how that works. It's not included in the console by default. I'll show you here. Pluralize the word error when there's 1 error. You can see it doesn't work, but we can include the helper that does that. Action view, helpers, text helper, text helper. So you can see that pluralize 1 error is just 1 error, and then if we do pluralize 2, that's 2 errors, and so on. And then I think 0 is also right. 0 errors is the usual convention. Yeah. So this pluralize method uses a really powerful inflector under the hood. So in this case, the inflection is the pluralization. So for example, we could do something like this. We could do pluralize, say, knows how to pluralize irregular plurals, things like woman pluralizes to women. And you can even do this. And erratum, the plural is errata. So it knows how to pluralize quite a lot of different things. And so we can use that in here to pluralize based on the user count, and we want to pluralize the word error. Like that. So now this sort of thing. Oops. What did it do here? Not errors.count. Oh, I need to put a comma here, don't I? Nope, still not working. Did I just not save it? Let me check that. Ah, there we go. I just didn't save the file for some reason. There we go. The form contains 1 error. All right, I mentioned that I wanted to style this a little bit, so let's actually do that. I'm just going to copy in the CSS. There you go. This is part of the forms CSS, so we can go here, and where's the forms? Right here. So it actually is right at the bottom, so here we go. So now the error explanation ID will have a red color, and each of the elements in the unordered list will be red as well. And then I'm actually going to add in some extra styling on what's called a form control class. This is part of Bootstrap, and then this is a standard color. This is the color for danger. You can see here we did alert danger, so that's the color that's being produced right here. Right, this color is the danger color. So this is using a Bootstrap variable. Again, it's not important to understand where this comes from for the purposes of web development. But there is one important thing, which is we need to put this form control class on these elements here. So let's save this, and then on this page we need to put the form control class on each of these fields. So let's do that. Just add that to each of these guys. Let's see what effect that had. Great, that's really nice. So now we've got some coloring here. We've got this red color. We've got this color that came automatically, or actually came because we put this in here, this in the error messages. Put it here, the danger color. But so now we've got the danger color again in this area here. So you can see if we put in something invalid, now the field is highlighted. So that's really useful. All right, so we've made major progress here. We are now successfully handling unsuccessful signups. So we still can't register a user, but if someone tries to sign up with invalid information, not only does it not cause any sort of errors in terms of the application, but we actually do have these useful error messages, and we even highlight the fields where the errors occur. Of course, one big disadvantage of what we've done so far is that if we want to check to see that it's still working, what we have to do is come to the page and start submitting things and make sure that we still get the right error messages and so on. So this is incredibly inconvenient, but this is why we have integration tests. So before moving on to successful signup, what we're going to do is write a short integration test capturing the behavior that we've now implemented successfully so that we can catch any regressions in the future. Let's get started here. Actually, just going to exit. So let's start by generating an integration test. In this case, let's say it's a sign up for users. So let's do users sign up. Remember, this will be converted to user sign up test. Rails will append _test. We haven't specified that this is unsuccessful signup because we'll use this same file for successful signup later in this lesson. So I'm going to open up the console again. Remember, Rails C is a shorthand for console. And let's take a look at the user count. So this is the count of the users in the database, and right now it's 0 because we ran the rake db migrate reset. So the way the test is going to work is we're going to hit this page, this sign up page, with a request, with an invalid request, or a request with invalid information, and we're going to verify that the count of the users does not change. So the user.count is the same before and after. So let me show you how to do that. Close these down. Open up our test. It's in test, integration, user sign up test, and oh, I should fire up guard, shouldn't I? All right, so this is our integration test, and I'm going to start by getting the sign up path. Remember, because of this get sign up, we have a named route, so we can do get sign up path. This is not strictly necessary. So what we're doing is we're simulating coming into this page, this /signup, and then submitting information. Now, it's not actually necessary to get the signup path in order to do this because inside of the test, we're going to be issuing a post request directly to the /users URL, just the way this button does. But it's nice to have this here, this get signup path, because it'll catch any really bad mistakes. Like if we forget an @user variable, then this get will fail and our test will fail, which is exactly what we want if the application is buggy. So we can actually even just save that and run our test to get started. Oh, and in fact, it did give me an error. What happened there? Signup path is not defined. That's weird. Oh, I'm just being stupid. This needs to be inside of a test. So we need to do test and then actually define a test as this test invalid signup information. And then do end. So let's get to green here. There are actually no assertions here, but any exceptions raised by this will cause an error. By the way, I mentioned how much it annoys me to see things like 1 errors. Well, look at this. That's the way it goes. Okay, so now what we want to do is something like this. We want to have a count before we submit to the signup path. So we can do this, user.count, and then we want to post to the user's path with some information. And it's going to be a hash. In fact, let's put that hash in. It's going to be a user hash, so key user, and then the value is another hash, which is the information we want to submit. So let's just do this. Name, it's going to be empty, email. We just want invalid information here. Just having one of them invalid is enough, but I'm going to make them all invalid just to emphasize what we're doing. Actually, I want to do this. Let's line these up. So this essentially simulates inside the test the submission here. If we do submission here, you can see that this is effectively a hash down here. So what we're doing is we're submitting a hash that's got an empty name, invalid email, and then password and confirmation that don't match and are too short. Like I said, though, it doesn't really matter as long as this is invalid. That's all we're going to test. So there are a bunch of things we could test. We could test the write error messages, but we're just going to test a couple of very simple things. We're going to make sure that it renders the new template, which is from this. We're going to make sure that it re-renders the new template. So we're going to do this here. You recall the way we do that is with assert template. So users/new. And if you're curious where else we use that, if you say, well, I saw that before, but I don't remember where, you can actually search through the entire project like this. You can find, you can see that we also use it in the site layout test right here. So that's where we saw this before. Save that. This will actually work. This should be green. We've got one assertions. And then we've got the before count. Let's do the after count here. So what should happen if we submit invalid information? Well, the before count and the after count should be the same. So we can do this. Oops, before count. Looks like the tab trigger was overriding the tab completion is what happened there. So can assert these. Have we used this before? We can find out. I don't recall offhand, but no, this is the first time we've used assert equal. So assert equal just verifies that the two things are equal. And you can see we're green. So this actually worked. This means that this submission did not change the number of users in the database. So this is a nice test. But this isn't quite idiomatically correct. There's a slightly more elegant way to do this using a different assertion called assert no difference. Show you how that works. No difference. And this takes as an argument the thing that we want not to differ. In this case, user.count. And then it takes a block. And what we do is we just put the code in the block that we want to have not change user.count in this case. Get rid of this. Part of the reason this is nice is we actually eliminate both of these variables. So tab this in just to show the structure. And so what this does is the same thing that we did before. It asserts that user.count does not change when this code is executed. Being able to do things like this is a really powerful way of extending a language, and it's this block that allows you to do it. It's because of Ruby blocks that we have the flexibility to make this kind of method. So let's save this and verify that we're still green. And there we go. Now, you might also want to test things like the particular error messages, or just that there's an error messages div, say with the right ID, and writing a test for that kind of functionality, or extending this test here in order to cover some of the other things that happen on this page, is left as an exercise. But this test is quite good. It will catch any sort of major regressions. And so at this point, we're ready to move on to handling a successful submission that actually creates a new user. Let's take a look at the current state of our create action. Here we are. We've got @user defined using the user params defined down here. Well, I should mention, by the way, this technique here is called strong parameters. Won't ever really matter what it's called, but if you need to Google around for it, that's what it's called, strong parameters. So then what we do here is we try to save the user, and if that doesn't work, then we render back the new page. So that's what we've got working, and now we just need to fill in this comment here, handle a successful save, with the code to actually do the handling. In fact, it's going to be quite simple. The main thing we're going to do is redirect the user to the profile page. So let's take a look at the mock-up. There's a mock-up for this. It's right here. So this is the profile page we had back here, just basically with an avatar and a name. And then there's one extra element, which is this greeting here at the top, welcome to the sample app. So after a successful registration, we want the user to be redirected to the profile page with this sort of message. So the first part is really easy. Let's take a look at it. Let's take a look first at what happens if we actually do submit valid information. So let's try this. So this is valid. Let's see what happens. See if you can guess. So what happened here is that we got an error because Rails is trying to find a create template. So what's going on here is the submission came in, the user got created using the parameters, and now instead of failing, this @user.save actually succeeded. In fact, we can even look. User.count is now 1, which is an indication that we'll probably want to reset the database. But this is the sort of thing that actually created the user. So in a sense, this form does work right now. But in this line, what's happened is the save succeeded, so this is true. And by default, Rails is trying to render a template with the same name as the action. In this case, create template, but that doesn't exist. And the usual convention in Rails, and indeed in web development generally, is to redirect upon successful sign up. So we can do that here using redirect to. Now, one of the things we can do here is we can put in the URL for the user. That's the user path. Actually, remember, for a redirect, we actually need a fully qualified URL. User path would probably work, but the HTTP standard requires this. User URL, and then the user. And since we're going to reset the database anyway, let's just put in another valid one. Let's try another valid sign up. So that actually worked. This is now a working sign-up form. So there's only one thing left to do, which is to get that little message to work, this thing here. But there is one refinement I want to do before moving on to that, which is that this is not idiomatically correct Rails. Like, this is going to work. This is the user URL, which is just the profile URL, in this case, /user/2. But in Rails, you can actually omit this part here. You can just say redirect to @user, and Rails infers from context that what we want to do here is redirect to the user's profile page, or in this case /user/1 or /user/2. So in other words, this is equivalent to this. Try one more time. You can see that's the same thing. By the way, if you find this sort of resubmission of the form cumbersome and think, boy, it sure would be nice to have a test for that, yeah, I agree, and we'll be doing that in this section. So now there's only one thing left, which is to get this message to work, this thing here. The way to do that is with a really useful hash-like object called the flash. This is something that comes with Rails. Let me get rid of this here. And so what we can do with the flash is give it a key. In this case, we're going to call it success. And we'll say the value is the string welcome to the sample app. So the way the flash works is that it tells Rails that this data should only persist for one request. So when we redirect, we will be able to render this into our site template, which we're about to do, but then it will disappear on subsequent invocations of the page. So that'll become clear with an example. First, I want to remind you that we actually did something similar to this before. In lesson 4, we iterated through a hash called flash. This isn't technically a hash. It's actually using a cookie probably somewhere under the hood. I don't even know exactly how it works, but the idea is that we can treat it like a hash, and then Rails can pull out the data on the next request. But in the console, we're going to use a real hash, which is this. The key here is, let's say, success, it worked. And danger, this is another key we could use. It failed. And we did something like this before. We did flash.each. We can iterate through each key value pair. Oops. And you can see that it says success, it worked, danger, it failed. So this sort of iteration is something we can also do inside of our application. So let's take a look at our template. Where is it? It's in application.html.erb. Here it is. So what we're going to do in the site layout is render any flash messages that we encounter. This will happen inside the main part of the container here, just above the main content. So what we're going to do is iterate through the flash. But the key value pairs are really the message type, success or danger, and the message itself. Oops, D doesn't go there. Even I mess that up sometimes. I've been programming in Ruby for a while. All right, flash.each do message type message. And then inside here, what we want to do is put in a div that has a class that will let us style the div and then the message. In fact, the styling will come for free for the most part from Bootstrap. So the class here is going to be alert, and then we're going to give it an alert dash something. This may look familiar if we go back to the error messages partial. Here we did alert danger. Now what we're going to do is put in a div with the class given by the message type. So if we put in the message type of danger here, then it will be styled as danger, or if it's success, it will be styled as success. So these words have special meanings to Bootstrap in terms of these classes. So we're going to interpolate that. It's a symbol, but if we interpolate it, it'll just be like a string. That's what happened down here. We did this interpolation. In fact, this might not even have been necessary. I bet this probably works. I don't know. Yeah, it does. So we probably didn't even need that. But in any case, here we go. We're going to interpolate the message type. And then, oh, and so this actually won't work because this is just regular HTML. See, what this will do is actually interpolate something that looks literally like this. So we actually need, and this is really ugly, and there's an exercise in the book to make this prettier. And the reason I don't like it is because it's so hard to parse visually. So what we actually need to do is do embedded Ruby even inside here. So this is the way that you might be able to have figured out how to do it, but this is not the nicest way. So I'd recommend looking in the exercises to do this the right way, or what I consider the best way. And then in here, we're going to actually put in the message. So this is, in this context, the message type is success, and the message is welcome to the sample app. And this is embedded Ruby inside this, this class. It's kind of weird. All right, let's save these things. And if we did everything right, we should be ready now to make our first sign up. So let's actually eliminate the current contents of the database. I'll do it here where there's a server running. So it's probably a good idea to exit the server and restart it after clearing the database. Okay, let's clear the database now. Remember, that's rake db migrate reset. All right, I'm getting some really sluggish behavior here. I'm going to kill this, and I'm going to kill those Spring processes that sometimes gunk things up. I'm going to get rid of this, and just verify that there are a bunch of them. Yeah, there really aren't that many, but I think this will probably help. And restart this here. And let's try this again. Yeah, that was a lot faster. Okay. And we can also run the test suite here, just to get it to run once. All right, so let's take a look at the current state of the application. It should be working, so we should be ready to do a first sign up. Let's take a look at this. Oh, that's right, this window has the server. Here we go. So let's take a look at our test suite while that's booting up. Yeah, so we're completely green, which is good. And let's take a look at the state of the server. All right, so we're ready to do our first sign up. So let's call the name Rails tutorial and the email example at railstutorial.org. Remember, that's one of the addresses that I've associated with a Gravatar image. And then you can pick whatever password you want. And so now when I click submit, it should not only redirect to the profile page, but it should also have a nice flash message. So let's see if that works. I'm not sure it will, but I hope it will. There it is. Look at that. So this is styled in this nice green color because of the success key we gave it right here. So here in the application layout, there is a message type here of success. And so this div has class alert success, and Bootstrap automatically styles that nicely, so we can inspect that, in fact. You can see here, alert success. So that's where the styling is coming from. I'll go ahead and save that password. We'll probably use it again. And of course, we can see that the Gravatar image appears as it did before. So this is great. This is a successful sign up. Let's actually take a look at the database. We probably will have to restart this thing. Yeah, so it still says 3. I don't think reload bang is enough, but it might be. Let's take a look. Now, in fact, it's freezing, so I don't know what's going on here. I'll just Control-C it. Ugh. All right. Let's get out of it. Control-D a couple times. This is just the way it goes sometimes in web development life. I don't know why it's stuck. Okay, there it goes, finally. All right, let's restart that Rails console. You know, it's nice to do Rails C because it's short, but if you're going to look for the process, it's actually nice to be able to grep for console. So there actually is an advantage to using the full name. All right, now we can do user.count. It should be 1. Good. User.first, and there it is. That's the one we just put in. Now, I mentioned before something about the flash, this thing here. What is the point of that? Why can't we just put in the message by hand with embedded Ruby, say? And the answer is because we don't want this message appearing every time the user goes to the profile page. We want it to disappear after this first request. So what happened here is we submitted the form, got redirected, and this flash message appeared. But if we then, say, just refresh the browser, it disappears. Same thing would have happened if I'd clicked over to a different page. Of course, as with unsuccessful signup, we don't want to have to submit things by hand every time to test that things are working. So let's write a test for valid submission over here. Our user signup test. It's going to be pretty much the same as this in principle. We don't really need this line here, but I like to put it in again. So let's put in a test. Actually, we can just copy this thing wholesale, can't we? So let's test valid signup information. So now instead of this assert no difference, we're actually going to assert that there is a difference of 1. So the way that works is we go here and say assert difference. Instead of user.count, we say user.count and then give it the actual count we expect. The change of 1 in this case. And then I'm going to put in a valid name. Let's do example user. User at example.com. And let's do just password of password. And now in this case, this post will actually work. This will, in fact, let's run this test, comment this out. So this is now posting to the user's path. But what I really like to do at this point is assert that the template is user's show. And you think, well, that'll work, right? But it won't. And the reason is because this post doesn't follow the redirect. We can actually do this. Follow redirect bang will follow the redirect inside the test. So this now works. But there's a way to combine these together. Post via redirect, and it's a little more compact. Get rid of that space there, line things up. And now what this is doing is getting the signup path. Again, this is just a sanity check. The truth is we're already testing it here, but I like the idea that the integration test is a simulation of what we would actually do in the browser, which is to say go to the signup path, and then this is the post, this is clicking on the link, and then we say, okay, it should show the user show page. Now, a lot of things have to go right for this assert template to work. So this is quite a sensitive test of the profile page. It's not testing the details of the profile page, but it's testing that the profile page is working. And it's for reasons like that that integration tests are so useful. I just noticed a minor formatting issue. This is not going to affect the execution of the code or anything, but I lined these up wrong in terms of the normal convention I use. I really like these keys to be lined up vertically so you can see the structure. And actually notice this too. You can line up these values. This is just a minor detail, but I think it's really nice to have the code formatted this way because it's easier just to see at a glance what the structure of the code is when it's lined up nicely. So this will revert in just a moment. You'll see there's a little continuity error, but this is the formatting I recommend. So this is the end of the basic user signup. We actually did it. We've got a new user in our database, our development database, that is. And so to me, this is really the beginning of the real magic of web development. We are now rendering a page using dynamic data submitted through a form on the web. And in the subsequent lessons, we're going to build on this foundation to make the rest of the sample app. Before moving on, as usual, we're going to deploy this application to production. But now that this application is actually doing something useful, there are a couple of refinements I'd like to add to make our deployment professional grade. As usual, we'll merge our topic branch into the master branch and then deploy. So let's go over here. So first we have to add all the files. Finish user signup. And let's check out master. There we go. Now let's take a look at the current state of our production application. I don't remember the name of it offhand, so let's do Heroku open. This doesn't actually work on the Cloud IDE, but it will give us the name. Here we go. So it's this, copy that, and then here we go. It's thatthing.herokuapp.com. There we are. All right, there are a couple of things I'd like to note here that are not completely industrial strength. So the first is that if you look here in this area of the address bar, it's just a regular document icon, but over here, it's a lock with HTTPS. So this is a really important distinction. And in order to avoid what's called a session hijacking vulnerability, it's important that all the traffic on our production site be encrypted using HTTPS. So this prevents people from, say, using what's called a packet sniffer to look at the information on a public Wi-Fi network, for example. This would let a malicious attacker, for example, intercept things like session cookies, which would allow them to log in as a particular user. Enabling SSL, or technically speaking, TLS, or Transport Layer Security, on a custom domain is a little bit tricky, but in this case, we're actually running on Heroku, so because we're using this Heroku domain, herokuapp.com, we can piggyback on their SSL certificate. That's what it's called. So the way to do that is to open up the production configuration. Actually, let me show you where it is. It's in config environments production.rb. I mentioned it's technically called TLS, but everyone still calls it SSL. So here it is, config.force SSL true. So let's uncomment that to say, yes, we do want to force that to be true. And the other thing we want to change is the web server used on Heroku. So by default, Heroku uses a web server called WebRick, which is also used here locally. You can see here. And WebRick is great because it's super lightweight, it's written in pure Ruby, but it is not designed as a production web application server. So instead of WebRick in production, we're going to use something called Unicorn. And this just requires us to read a little bit of documentation and define a couple of files. So let me show you how that works. This is just a short insert as an indication of how fast things can change in Rails land. The recommended web server has already changed. It used to be Unicorn. As you can see here at Heroku's Dev Center, there's some instructions for using the Unicorn server. But in fact, now Heroku recommends Puma, a different web server. So let's look at that. This is the same sort of configuration. The steps are almost exactly the same, though. In fact, I've already updated the tutorial. So let's just scroll down and see what's involved. There's a config file called puma.rb. So let's make that. And you can open it up. I'm just going to copy it here. It's not at all important to know how this works. I don't know how it works. I'm just copying from the Rails tutorial, which in turn copied from the Dev Center here at Heroku. And then we need to make a proc file. Again, I'm not even really sure what this is, but I can follow documentation just as well as anyone else. Oops, that wasn't it. There, proc file. Okay. And then we can add these here. We can just do git add -a, and then commit-m, add SSL, and Puma web server in production. Now this message here will be different for you because I've already gone through the whole screencast to get to this point. This is just a little touch-up screencast. But that's no cause for concern. As long as you follow the steps that I've shown you, you should be able to run Puma in production once you push to Heroku. There's one more thing you should check, just in case you already pasted in the gem file from before I made the Puma changes. You should check the gem file to make sure that you're in fact using the Puma gem. So instead of gem unicorn, it should say gem Puma. If you started this from the beginning, this gem file was updated automatically. But it could be that I made the change kind of midstream. So if you were following the tutorial along and then I made the change in the middle while you were doing it, you might have this continuity problem. So just make sure that your gem file has the right gem here for the production web server, Puma in this case. And of course, you'll have to install it. Before moving on, as usual, we're going to deploy this application to production. But now that this application is actually doing something useful, there are a couple of refinements I'd like to add to make our deployment professional grade. As usual, we'll merge our topic branch into the master branch and then deploy. So let's go over here. So first we have to add all the files. Finish user sign up. And let's check out master. There we go. Now let's take a look at the current state of our production application. I don't remember the name of it offhand, so let's do Heroku open. This doesn't actually work on the Cloud IDE, but it will give us the name. Here we go. So it's this, copy that, and then here we go. It's thatthing.herokuapp.com. There we are. Let's push up to Bitbucket, since we're at a natural stopping point here, and then deploy it. All right, I've had reports from some readers of the Rails tutorial book that they have to run the migration at Heroku at this point. It shouldn't be necessary, but for completeness, it doesn't do any harm. So just do Heroku run rakedb migrate. And now we're ready to do a sign up on the production site. All right, we can sign up now. Put in my name. And this is my actual email address. As you might expect, I have a Gravatar image associated with that. And this is a production site. I mean, this is secure. You can see the lock here. This is SSL now. So I can use a real password. I mean, we've got industrial grade encryption on the back end with bcrypt. So I'm going to use a real password here. And there it goes. Welcome to the sample app. Check it out. So this is running on the live web. Here's the little Gravatar I mentioned. We've got the lock here with HTTPS. And because we switched from WebRick to Unicorn, the web server is now production ready as well. And finally note that the debug information, which appears in a development environment, does not appear on Heroku because Heroku runs in a production environment. This is a huge milestone for our sample application. If you think of all the things that have to go right to get this page to render correctly, we've submitted successfully using a form, we've persisted the submitted information to a database running on a production server, and we've rendered a page that's personalized based on the information that we submitted. Now that users can sign up to the site, it would be nice for them to be able to log in and log out as well, and that's the subject of the next lesson.
Now that new users can sign up on our site, it's time to give them the ability to log in and log out. We'll start by implementing the simplest fully functional login model, which keeps users logged in for one session at a time, automatically expiring the session when users close their browsers.
In this lesson, we'll take a form like the one shown here, which you've probably seen thousands of times on the web, and actually get it to work. In fact, over the next 2 lessons, we'll be implementing all 3 of the most common models for login, logout behavior on the web. For getting users when they close their browsers, automatically remembering users even after they close their browsers, and optionally remembering users using a Remember Me checkbox. This is by far the most challenging lesson so far, but especially if you've never implemented a form like this before, it's really like magic. You've seen this over and over again, but in this lesson we're actually going to make this thing work. So let's get started by talking about the basic theory behind this sort of login idea. The basic idea behind login is that once a user is logged in, we'll be able to customize the view, for example, like this. We'll be able to